CSM. The elections are over. The people have spoken, and we have the council we deserve, if not the council we want. Let's hop right into it. So the proud winners, we'll go over them. Angry Mustache from Goonstorm Federation, Arisa Elkin from Electus Matari, Brisker Ball from The Initiative, Jinx DeCare from Brave Collective, Kazanir from Goonstorm Federation, Kenneth Feld from Pandemic Legion, Luke Aninan from Fraternity, Mark Resurrectus from Turbo Feed or Glory, Pando from The Initiative, and Storm Delay from Pandemic Horde. Now, if you've been counting, that is 4 Imperium candidates, 2 PanFam candidates for a total of 6. You throw Jinx and the Fraternity guy in there, that's 8 nullsec candidates out of 10. And of course, being one of the bigger stories to come out of this election cycle. Any surprises there for you, Zero or Nora?
No, Alec. The people have spoken, and the people, I think, at least those who vote in the elections, are overwhelmingly from the sort of nullsec campus. It would seem. I think there's a lot to be said for how organised the sort of nullsec candidates are, and how they definitely get the most out of the votes that they can influence. And perhaps were the opposition or the competition, if they were organised differently, perhaps they could compete more. But I think even then, we would still see, obviously, an overwhelming representation from nullsec. And, that's where, the heart of the game has typically been, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the folks that bemoan that there's not more non-nullsec representation on the CSM, they're typically loud, they're typically after the fact, and there's typically way more of them posting on Reddit than voting, apparently, because every year it's the same story. We see nullsec turn out in droves. I don't think they're the majority of the game, but of the voting population, there's certainly a higher percentage of nullsec players that take the time to vote. Unlike physical elections, there's no physical or economic barriers to voting. Everybody's got access to the polls with just a click away, access to all the candidate information they could ever hope for. And they're the people that care, ultimately. And they might only care because their alliance leaders are pinging them, telling them to care, but they still go out and do it.
Yes, and of course, many players play in other areas of space. But if those players are not organised and together on a particular issue, looking at that long list of candidates, they may pick a candidate based on something they've heard about or something they've read. But there's so many to choose from that at the end of the day, unless the competition can find some way to sort of group up on issues or narrow down sort of their strategy on how to communicate, who people should be voting for if they want particular sort of play styles represented. I think this is something that we're just going to continue to see. And of course, the people have spoken, right? They want. This is who they want on the CSM. And, there's been a lot of complaints since about sort of whether the voting should be done in a different way or whether it's fair. And I think ultimately, it's a democratic process. It's great that the process is such that lots of votes are not wasted. And you can choose somebody who perhaps is your favorite candidate without missing out on voting for somebody else if that person doesn't get through the early rounds. But ultimately, the people have spoken. They've said who they want to represent them, and people, I think, should respect that and move forward now. And we should see what comes next.
Yeah, and I think that's key. The voting system we have may not be perfect, but we do have a voting system where you can vote for the candidate you really want, the candidate that you feel is best represent your interests or that you most trust to do the right thing, without having to worry about if they're actually going to have a shot at winning. You can put them on there, and you can put 5 candidates like that on there, and you don't have to think ahead of time about their electability before you make that choice. And I think that's a key aspect of the voting process that EVE has that, for instance, my own nation does not have, and I like that it brings in a diversity of candidates. I like that people don't have to do the political calculus in their head before they cast their vote. But at the same time, I think you touched on it, and we were talking about it before the show. There is something we said for the candidates spreading themselves so thin. We had over 40 candidates who were effectively running for 2, maybe 3 spots, right? Because the null block vote, as organized as it was, you knew that unless there was unprecedented turnout from other parts of the game, that certain blocks had the voting power to elect a certain number of candidates. Goons are going to get 3, at least. PanFam will get 2. Fraternity, they could elect 1. Last year they didn't. I believe they put their voting power behind not their own candidate. When this year they corrected that mistake, they got a candidate on. You can do the math, and there are certain slots that are probably going to go to those folks, like I said, unless there's unprecedented turnout from other places. So, you've got a very tiny shot. And I think what we see in the elimination rounds is a lot of candidates that don't have enough support to put them at number 1 getting knocked out in great numbers before we even get to relatively competitive candidates. And I do think that's an issue. It's plagued the wormhole community before. They've gone entire years without a representative, despite being a fairly populous region of the game. This year, they put their votes together. They got behind one candidate, threw everything behind him, and that candidate took the time to go out and get himself on other ballots, so he got some down ballot support, and lo and behold, elected.
Absolutely. And I think for me, one of the surprises was that Ithaca missed out. But when you look at the voting power of the organized blocks, and you look at, like you say, that the sort of number of spaces left over for other candidates, it's no real surprise that Ithaca then was struggling to compete there. But I think I felt a sense of disappointment among the people I've spoken to and some of the things I've read, that people are a bit sorry that Ithaca didn't get on. Fortunately, in some sense, perhaps, as the first runner-up, it's not impossible. And it's certainly happened before, isn't it, where somebody has dropped out midway through the term. And maybe Ithaca will get a chance, but maybe next year.
In fact, Arcia was the alternate that got moved on and really made the most of her partial term, and now she's just been straight up reelected. It's number 2 on the Declarations of War ballot, number 1 on the Faction Warfare ballots. Just an overall effective, timely representative. She knows her stuff. She has a proven track record of effectively influencing CCP's decision making. And it just happens to be an area where, at least for the next year, probably more, CCP is going to put a lot of their thought and resources and development time and that sort of stuff. So, to me, she was a no-brainer candidate.
Indeed, for me, I'm sorry that Stitch didn't get a bit more support, because I find Stitch's writing on balance very, very sensible, and Stitch's approach to feedback relating to the game I find very of a high quality, and I think that would have been a great asset for the CSM and for CCP to have had during this time. But hopefully Stitch's feedback will still exist out there, and it won't matter too much that Stitch isn't on the CSM to give that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, Tuskers is a very respectable alliance, but very small. I think Stitch's goal, if he really wants to get on, and I think he should run again, because he was number 1 on the Declarations of War ballot for a reason. He was highly placed last year. He's a fantastic person. I like every answer I think I've ever heard him give on interviews, as far as his level of thought put into the game and the things that he wants to see, things I would like to see. But I don't think we can have the small gang community being split between him and Gideon and Ithaca. At some point, we have to go, okay, this is our number 1, this is our number 2. And then that person then has to do a lot of work to try to get onto some of these bigger ballots, get the support of these communities to get on there, even communities that might seem diametrically opposed. I have to highlight the Mike Azariah path to office, a high-sec player that was focused on high-sec players and new players, managed to get himself on the ballots of just about every major null-sec block because they got to like him. He was just a genuinely good, friendly person. He put a lot of time to build those relationships. And, when those candidates got knocked out or they got their number one candidate elected, he was getting significant down-ballot support from just about everyone, in addition to having his own solid initial voting base that kept him in the running to collect all of those. That's a very viable path to the CSM for someone who doesn't have support from a major alliance.
I wonder, Alec, I just cast my mind back to some of the controversies, some of the things that the small gang representatives might have talked about during the election campaign, and how perhaps some of the null block people were a bit concerned about some of the things they'd heard. I wonder whether there's scope for such a candidate, somebody who the small gang community is prepared to get behind, whether they could make some concessions on some of the things they campaign on. Because ultimately, does it really matter to everybody in the small gang community, let's say in relation to jump gates and answer blocks, the stuff around that? It really is a divisive issue. I personally don't have much to say about it. I think it's an interesting idea to talk about stuff, big changes to the game. But if somebody said to me, it's a really bad idea, let's not go there, I'd be prepared to concede on that myself, because there's plenty of other things to think about. If it only affects the small gang community a little bit, is it really worth, butting heads? What do you think about things like concessions in order to get on? Is that something maybe people need to do to get on these larger ballots?
I don't think it's so much about concessions as it just showing that you're a good person to work for and that you're bringing a valuable perspective to the table. If you're being combative and you don't have your own source of support, why should other people listen to you if all you're going to do is yell at them or act like you're better than them? That's why, certain candidates from low-sec or small gang warfare community don't have much of a chance of getting on those ballots because they tend to think of themselves as in opposition to. I think Mike's strategy was more to, show himself as a partner that he could contribute valuably. He wasn't there to set up an us versus them type thing about a way to just give a voice in the council that wasn't there and, show that he was in general a positive person to represent the community as a whole. And really beat that drum fairly constantly to a lot of different null communities. And he was able to get in there. And once he got on, the other CSMs found him to be very cool to work with. They like what he brought to the table. So they continually recommended him to be on their ballots in some capacity. He wasn't always very high, but he was there. And as their candidates either got elected or weren't viable, he would get that down ballot support. The CSM doesn't really pass legislation or anything like that, so there's not really much compromise to be had. I think it's more your style and communication strategies that you're employing rather than a particular stance you have that you need to make a compromise on or not compromise.
Yes, I think ultimately we're all trying to work for the health of the game overall, I imagine. And everything I hear when people talk, they all seem to have the same goal in mind, really. And I can imagine that just opening those lines of communication to show that this is somebody who, I'm somebody who you'd want to work with, isn't it? I suppose somebody who you'd want to talk about the game with, talk about some of the things that CCP might be proposing, and maybe share some ideas, and maybe things just go from there.
Yeah, I think Stitch, to his credit, probably has that ability. Just, got to put the legwork in, start making inroads. He's acts and says and does all the right things and all the different podcasts and stuff I've seen him on, but some of it's working directly with people and going outside your comfort zone a little bit more.
To be continued.
Yeah, Nora, what's your take as a blogger, I'm sure you've been following the situation quite closely.
Yeah, sure. Speaking about Stitch, he actually was a number one spot of my ballot, my personal one, and Arcia was at the second. So at least one of the two made it on. So I'm kind of happy about that. Still a bit disappointed we have so much block candidates. But yeah, that's how it goes. But I think people, if they put in the effort, can still make an impact with giving good feedback, and especially Stitch Cannon is one of the guys who can do that. I remember the changes that were happening to the interdiction nullifier modules, which changed interceptors heavily. And at first, this module was intended to be a low slot, which would have completely messed up the whole meta, to say it diplomatically. And the malediction and Ares would have been really in trouble. And the Crow, at least, that chip only has 2 low slots to begin with, and it needs all that low slots to for alignment and speed. You cannot sacrifice one for an interdiction nullifier. And I remember Stitch making this huge Reddit post about it, and after that it didn't took long, and this module became a high slot. So that was a workable situation then. And I think that change came especially from a null block perspective, because Fuzzy claws were still a thing back then. A fleet of claws, 200 claws, warping in to an Entosis link, shooting the Drake or Prophecy or whatever it was that did the Entosising, volleyed it and warping back out again. And that was possible because the interceptors were still nullified, and there was the cooldown on it, like there is now. And you basically had no drawbacks to it. So now I think we are in a somewhat workable spot, which fixed that Fuzzy Claw problem, but also doesn't completely mess up a small gang hunting interceptor. So it's kind of a good spot we ended up with. But I wonder how it would have turned out without Stitch making this big Reddit post about it. So I hope he continues posting also when not being on the CSM.
Absolutely.
I think he will. I mean, he cares about it. It's a passion, obviously. So I just, I'm saying immortal, candidates like him don't get discouraged, even if you didn't make it on this year. It can be a bit of a marathon, not a sprint, to get on, especially if you don't come from a large block. And, there's try to get on the null blocks method, and there's also try to expand your own voting base method. Find people that haven't voted and convince them to vote for you next time. But that's a really difficult one. I think the voting public, the body of votes, has more or less stayed fairly constant. Which is actually itself interesting, considering the game population is going down.
Yes. I heard it mentioned during the sort of the run-up to the actual announcement of the result, and shortly after, how perhaps people who stream, perhaps with a good following on Twitch, how they have a lot of power, voting sort of power.
Apparently not.
Yes, not enough, but and then you've got people who have a different type of input into the game community and a different type of in-game notoriety. And I wonder if a combination of the two is kind of what's needed. Somebody who creates sort of that content, like a stream, but then also has a finger in every other pie. In terms of the other things that are done. Maybe that would be enough in combination to tip somebody over the edge. And I know, for example, Arcia is an example of somebody who does a bit of everything in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I mean, shout out to Torvald. He came really close. He was right behind Ithaca. But then you had other streamers, like Redline, I think was the first out. So just being a good streamer, not enough. Although it did work for iBeast when he ran. So it's not completely outside the realm of possibility. I mean, when I ran, my base was mostly declarations of war listenership, and then I did a lot of back channeling with smaller nullsec alliances to get their people in. But Yeah, I mean, it helps to have a big, nice base of support you can start from. I think that's where the potential for streamers is. But it's, in that sense, you're kind of competing for votes, right? Because you're competing with other streamers. You're competing with, because I presume a lot of the people that are watching those streams are nullsec players. You're probably competing with their alliance block vote, which I think is probably what happened with Redline.
Yeah, and I think IBeast or Lucy Liu was on the Imperium belt as well.
Hmm.
So I guess that helped a lot.
Well, interesting stuff, and I want to give a thank you to the Ancient Gaming Noob, who did some really good ballot analysis, which went behind the scenes and put out in text form a lot of great stuff, including who voted for who, the elimination orders, ballot groupings, that kind of thing. Really fantastic. You'll find a link to that in the show notes.